Good day. Today is Friday 29th November and the internet is buzzing with rumours and speculation that we're going to get another big Oreshnik strike somewhere in Ukraine tomorrow. And I suspect that what has triggered this speculation is that some days ago the Russian authorities announced that starting from tonight, the airspace around the Kapustin Yar space center near Astrakhan, near the Caspian Sea, has been closed to air traffic. Well, that might be the case. I have seen some suggestions that this is an over-interpretation of the decision to close the airspace, that if you follow the pattern, apparently, of launches and tests that take place in Kapustin Yar, the closure of airspace around it is not such an unusual thing, and that it could just be that an ordinary test is being carried out. Kapustin Yar, I should say, is a very active space center and cosmodrome, and that rocket tests take place there at fairly regular intervals. But anyway, we will just have to wait and see. We will have to wait and see what exactly it is that the Russians are planning. In the meantime, it's very clear to me that there is now a major effort underway on both sides, both on the Russian side and on the Western side, to try to maneuver and prepare in advance of the inauguration of Donald Trump, in the expectation that Trump and his team are going to try to find some way to bring the conflict in Ukraine, if not to a stop, then at least to end direct American involvement in it. And there's been some very interesting articles about all of this. There was an interesting article in the Economist, very lengthy series of discussions, all talking about how to maneuver Trump. Basically, I mean, that's, if you read the article, that's what it really amounts to maneuver Trump into a position where he makes demands of the Russians which are essentially unacceptable. And there's all sorts of attempts to try to harden up the report by Kellogg and Feitz, the one that was drafted way back in April, and which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday. There are all kinds of attempts to sort of harden it up and to convert it into some sort of actual plan. In other words, to crystallize it into a real plan, a genuine proposal that will be put to the Russians, which I suspect a lot of people understand that the Russians will reject. So there are all of these discussions, all of these commentaries about sending European peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. That's at least the way that the discussion to send European troops to Ukraine is being explained. So the British and the French supposedly having all of those discussions at the present time. The suggestions that have been made by some people, Simplicus the thinker, by the way, is that all the commentaries and discussions that there have been about sending European troops to Ukraine are not about sending those troops to Ukraine in order to engage in actual combat, but rather in order to get those troops deployed to Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force once some sort of agreement or plan is presented. I'm going to say straight away that I think this interpretation is almost certainly wrong. It assumes that there is actually a plan that the Trump team are working towards, which I don't frankly think that they are. I think that all these discussions that are taking place in Europe are absolutely intended to send European troops eventually to Ukraine, with a clear mandate that they might eventually have to fight the Russians. I think also there is clearly an attempt underway, as I said, to force Donald Trump's hand, to try to present him in January with a cut and dried plan to send European troops to Ukraine, and basically to dare him to cancel it. Now, the Russian intelligence service, the SVR, has now published its own report in which they say that there is a plan in Europe being developed to deploy 100,000 troops to Ukraine, that these troops are to come from various countries, Germany, France being amongst them, Romania being another, by the way. Britain also will be participating, and the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is now talking about this as well. He says that absolutely British troops must participate in any mission to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. And the SVR says that there's even a plan that's been developed to divide Ukraine into zones and to allocate European troops to patrol particular zones. A deployment of 100,000 men, if that is what we are talking about, is not a deployment of a peacekeeping force. It is a deployment of an army to Ukraine, a European or NATO army to Ukraine, and its purpose clearly in that case would be to fight the Russians. Just saying. Now, of course, that all assumes that this report from the SVR is right, but perhaps the Russians do have information. I would not be surprised if they did. I'm sure there's all sorts of people, all sorts of chatter and discussion and gossip going on in the corridors of the European chancelleries, and I would not be at all surprised if there are some people in Europe who are becoming very concerned about the direction that all of this is taking and are tipping the Russians off about it. Anyway, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has stiffly reminded everyone, not just the Europeans, but also ultimately the Trump team, that any plan to deploy peacekeepers to any conflict zone can only take form if both parties to the conflict actually agree. And the implication is, of course, that the Russians have not agreed and are most unlikely to do so. By the way, the various reports, discussions, plans, schemes that may be floating around in Europe to send troops to Ukraine and to call them peacekeepers are not new. Before the special military operation took place, whilst there were still discussions about implementing the Minsk agreement, I can remember that the Ukrainians in particular were floating proposals to send Western forces to the contact line, calling them peacekeepers. There was even a proposal that their deployment should be authorized by a vote of the UN Security Council. And there were various attempts, as I remember, by various European officials and diplomats and even some American officials. I seem to remember that Kurt Volker, who was for a time the American envoy, who was supposed to be assisting with the implementation of the Minsk agreement, he was actually so strongly pro-Ukrainian, such a fierce neocon, that he basically sabotaged the Minsk agreement. But anyway, I remember that Kurt Volker in particular was someone who was acting as a pretty strong advocate of this plan. Anyway, the point is that the Russians said a categorical no, And as we will see shortly, I am sure from the latest words that Putin has said, he's given another lengthy press conference, I'm sure that the Russians would emphatically say no to this idea all over again. In fact, I have absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. So anyway, we need to be very clear about what this plan to send peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, is really about. It's not about actually sending a genuine peacekeeping force or anything of that kind. It is instead about deploying European and NATO forces to Ukraine as a kind of deterrent force, an army capable of fighting the Russians. Now, the SVR has also issued, as part of that report that I mentioned, it's also said that NATO is coming round to wanting an actual freeze of the conflict, because it has realized that Ukraine is no longer capable of winning the war. On the contrary, there is a real possibility that Ukraine will be defeated. And this part of the SVR report has been discussed, has been reported on by the Russian news agency TASS, the official Russian news agency. And these are extracts from the SVR report as published by TASS. Given the obvious lack of prospects for inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield, NATO is more inclined to freeze the Ukraine conflict. The West is looking to implement this scenario as an opportunity to restore the combat capability of Ukraine's army and prepare Kiev for revenge. NATO has been establishing training centers in Ukraine in an effort to train at least 1 million mobilized Ukrainians. The military bloc, that's to say NATO, intends to rebuild the Ukrainian defense industry. Active work is currently underway in cooperation with Western defense companies, including Germany's Rheinmetall. At NATO's headquarters, they recognize that without providing the Ukrainian armed forces with enough weapons and munitions, it would be unrealistic to expect the Ukrainians to conduct high-intensity military operations for long. So the SVR is saying, and one must assume that they are briefing the Russian government, briefing, in other words, Putin himself, that the entire plan, which is being developed by NATO headquarters in Brussels, by the Europeans, and possibly by some people within the Biden administration, is to try to, as I said, take these ideas that were there in the Kellogg Fights report of April, harden them up into a plan or negotiating strategy, present this to the Russians, try to strong-arm the Russians into agreeing to it, then flood Ukraine with NATO troops, rebuild Ukraine's arms industries, and train up the Ukrainian army so that at some point in the future, in a couple of years' time, Ukraine will be able to go back on the offensive and defeat the Russians, as the NATO EU neocon plan has always been. Those who have memories of the various Yugoslav wars will remember this scenario fairly well. Something not unlike this happened in the war that took place in Croatia. The Serb fighters in Croatia, in part under intense pressure from the government in Belgrade, agreed a peace or a freeze of the conflict with the Croatian authorities of that time. At that time, they were occupying substantial territories in southern Croatia, lived in, by the way, inhabited to a great extent, in fact, largely by Serbs. What then happened is that the United States and Germany, especially, began to rearm, re-equip, and retrain the Croatian army. And then after a certain period, the Croats, simply cancelled the agreement, launched an operation to regain all these territories, Operation Storm, as it was called. The Serbs were driven out, the territory was reoccupied by the Croatians, and the Serb population that lived there was forced or left as well. So this all reads a little bit like a replay of that. And if we go back to that article in The Economist, it too says that this is something that can be achieved, that the Russians are overstretched and overextended. Russian society and the Russian economy are facing intense strains, and the West, therefore, holds very strong cards, and it might be able, through diplomacy, which wouldn't really be diplomacy, through negotiations and bullying and bluff, to force the Russians into agreeing to some sort of scenario like this. Now, this is all an absolute dangerous fantasy. First of all, Russia is not Serbia, or I think we're still justified in talking about Yugoslavia at the time when the negotiation which was reached in Croatia that resulted in that temporary freeze was agreed. Russia is, by contrast, as I think has become increasingly clear, not just a great power, but even a superpower. It is the world's most powerful nuclear power, just saying. It is a very large, very diversified economy. And as I'm going to discuss shortly, later in this video, the belief that the economy in Russia and Russian society and the Russian military are overextended and overstretched is a victim, is a product of the Ukrainian and Western imagination. It is largely, I think, a product of this incessant information campaign, propaganda campaign, if you prefer, against the Russians, which has been underway for decades, and which, despite all of the accumulating facts that have been building up now for years, simply will not die. Some Westerners still find it, many Westerners still find it impossible to accept that no part of it is actually true. There's the narrative about Russia being a gas station, masquerading as a country, that its industries are fragile, that its economy is overextended, that it cannot sustain the military and industrial effort that it is engaging in, that the economy is somehow in some kind of decline, that financially, fiscally, it is overextended as well. We will come to all of this later. And that, of course, it is suffering impossibly heavy losses on the battlefronts. So there is, unfortunately, still this illusion which says that Ukrainians are clearly losing the war now, but if the Russians probably will want to freeze the conflict on terms favourable to ourselves, we can then bide our time, and then we can go back on the attack later. In a recent programme that Alex and I did on the Duran, we talked all about this, and we said that unfortunately there is clear evidence that significant members of Trump's own team subscribe to these fantasies, and they are fantasies. And unfortunately, this may have an effect in distorting their own understanding and may lead them to think that they are playing with stronger cards than they really do. If I can also, on that topic, briefly return to the subject of the Kellogg Fights report that I discussed so thoroughly yesterday. It's been pointed out to me by an absolutely unimpeachable source, by somebody who is very familiar with the internal politics of Washington, in fact, who knows many of the people involved. I'm not sure that he knows Fights himself. But anyway, he has told me, and this person absolutely knows what he is saying, that Fred Fights, the co-author of that report with Kellogg, is an absolute dyed-in-the-wool neocon. He is absolutely, he is universally perceived in that way right across the Washington bubble. And if we go back to the report, one can see, as I said, many of the fingerprints, the traces of this. The belief that Ukraine could have been, should have been armed to the hilt before the conflict began. As I said yesterday, had anything like that been done, it would not have deterred the Russians. It would have provoked the Russians to attack Ukraine earlier than they in fact did. On that point, can I say that I also have it from unimpeachable sources that in fact the process of arming Ukraine began much earlier than people know, that it actually started at a time when Barack Obama was still president. Obama himself, for various reasons, publicly opposed that idea. The bureaucracy, the Washington bureaucracy, staffed by the neocons, vehemently disagreed with him and began arming Ukraine already whilst he was president, doing so either without telling him, or perhaps he did know, and as he so often did whenever he was president, he knew that something that would turn out bad was going on, but he averted his eyes from it and pretended that he didn't know. So anyway, so that was one of the things about the report by Kellogg and Fights, which, as I said, stood out for me. This myth that Russia could have been deterred from attacking Ukraine. The report, there's a clear tension between understanding that for the Russians, Ukraine's entry into NATO was an absolute red line. That is understood in the report. Other parts of the report, however, still seem to see this as an objective that should be followed. And of course, we also have the odd fact about the report in that it is supposedly intended, or at least some people think it is intended, to advise Donald Trump. But the only actual advice it gives is addressed to President Biden. So anyway, lots of issues about that report, and I don't want to give the impression, I hope I didn't give the impression yesterday, that I thought it was a good analysis of the war. My point about it simply is this: it was a document created for the election in order to assist Donald Trump to get through the election. And it doesn't commit him to any particular course or set out for him any special plan once he wins the election, once he won the election and became president. Anyway, put all that aside, we can see what is going on. The Russians can see what is going on, and they are now busy taking their own moves. And that now brings me to what Putin said over the course of this press conference, which was a very powerful press conference one of the shorter press conferences that he has given. It was given directly after the Collective Security Treaty Organization meeting in Astana. It was given, in other words, in Astana. And as is always the way with Putin, it covered an awful lot of ground. The first questions were about bilateral relations with Astana, about economic links, about building nuclear power stations there, about developing future relations with Armenia and Afghanistan and those sort of places, about the Karabakh issue. I'm going to focus, however, in this program, obviously, on what Putin had to say about Ukraine. And he, first of all, made some very interesting points, and there was an exchange with a journalist from Izvestia. This is unusual because there was a question, there was a sort of to and fro between the journalists. I should say that all of the journalists who attended this meeting appear to have been drawn from the Russian media. Anyway, these sort of to and fro discussions between Putin and journalists are relatively rare, but this is how it went. So, Mr. President, during a recent narrow format meeting, you mentioned that Moscow has responded to the ongoing usage of US missiles for attacks on Russian territory. And then Putin said this: indeed, twice following the Oreshnik response, subsequently ATACMS were employed, twice more in the Kursk region. Although the damage is minimal, the mere fact of their usage, of course, cannot be overlooked, particularly as there has been some damage inflicted. And then the journalist fired back the question: you underline that Moscow is prepared to counter further escalation from the West. And then Putin went on, responded: I not only emphasized this, but also stated that we took action last night. And here I'm going to say that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with a very interesting report about one of the latest Russian missile strikes. By the way, Russian missile strikes across Ukraine are now taking place on an almost constant basis. I mean, one missile strike ends and another begins. But anyway, there has already been a response. Putin confirmed that. And then the question came back. My question pertains to the measures Russia is ready to implement. In your view, are there ongoing risks associated with the Western missiles being used against Russian territory? And Putin then went on to say that yes, there are. He said that the attacks are clearly taking place with the involvement of the Western powers. And then he spoke about how an attack had indeed been launched by the Russians, which is a counter-strike. And then he went on to say, we will certainly respond to such acts of aggression. The timing, methods, and weapons employed will be determined by the General Staff, as each target necessitates a specific approach and appropriate weaponry. It would be futile to target a minor objective with a hypersonic missile, akin to using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. We will, however, utilize our entire arsenal against significant targets. As I have previously mentioned, we do not rule out the combat employment of Oreshnik on military-industrial facilities or command centers, including those in Kiev. We remain cognizant that the Kiev authorities continue their attempts to target our critical assets, including those in St. Petersburg and Moscow. So he is saying that the Ukrainians are trying to attack Moscow and St. Petersburg. They've been doing this with drones. There is argument about if they get Taurus missiles, whether the Taurus missiles have the range to reach St. Petersburg and Moscow. But one way or the other, Putin is clearly hinting again here that the next Oreshnik strike may, he's not saying it will, target command centers in Kiev. Now, at this point, I think it might be useful if I go to what the Russian Defense Ministry said about the strike that took place in response to the attacks, the attacks with the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows on Russian territory. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry said yesterday. In response to attacks of the Kiev regime to the depth of Russian territory over the past week, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered strikes at deployment sites of Ukrainian long-range weaponry. On 25th November, 5 multiple launch rocket systems, which deploy ATACMS long-range missiles, including 2 launchers and 1 transport vehicle, were eliminated by Iskander ballistic missiles near Tokari, 8 kilometers northwest of Sumy, and 3 multiple launch rocket systems were destroyed near Malibobrik, 20 kilometers southeast of Sumy, as well as 30 specialists comprising crews of these launchers. So, what the Defense Ministry is saying is that in the area of Sumy region, the Russians destroyed 5 HIMARS launch vehicles, killing at least 30 members of their crews. 3 of them were located. Oh, sorry, 2 of them were located north of Sumy. 2 were located northwest of Sumy. 3 were located southeast of Sumy. 5 were destroyed in total. 5 ATACMS missiles, 5 ATACMS launchers. Now that looks to me like the biggest single destruction of HIMARS launch vehicles that the Russians claim to have destroyed over a limited space of time. They're not the Russian Defense Ministry is not saying that this was done over the course of a single day. It's not actually even identifying the days in which these launchers were destroyed, but it is saying that the destruction of all of these launchers took place after the 25th of November in response to the 2 latest ATACMS strikes which took place in Kursk region. Now, given that all of these launchers were located around Sumy, the city of Sumy, which is close to Kursk region on the Ukrainian side of the border, then I assume, though the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't confirm this, that these were the 5 launchers, that these 5 launchers were the launchers that were used to conduct the ATACMS strikes on Kursk and perhaps on Bryansk region before that. Perhaps there are more launchers. I understand that an ATACMS, a HIMARS missile can only launch 1 ATACMS missile at a time. And we saw that in the case of one of the strikes, I believe 5 missiles were used, and ATACMS missiles were used. And in the second strike against Kursk region, 8 missiles were used. So that would suggest that there are still some launchers that are still in Sumy region, which the Russians are presumably trying to track down. But it does look as if, at least the Russians say, the Russian Defense Ministry say, that they destroyed 5 of the launch systems. that were used to conduct the ATACMS strikes on Kursk region. If that is true, and I have no reason to believe that it is not, then we can already see that deploying ATACMS systems so close to the Russian border is putting those ATACMS systems, the HIMARS launchers and their personnel, in extreme danger, making it possible for the Russians to pick them off and destroy them en masse and very fast. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry gave us some further reports about what they did over the last couple of days. They said that on 25th and 26th November, actually I go back, I want to just correct something I said. The Russians do say that the strike on the HIMARS launchers in Sumy region was conducted on the 25th of November. So that would suggest that the strike took place almost very shortly after the ATACMS strikes on Kursk, which reinforces my opinion that these HIMARS launchers were indeed some of the launchers that were used in conducting the ATACMS strikes on Kursk. Just to say, sorry about that, but sometimes it's not easy for me to read these things. Anyway, they then say that on the 25th and 26th of November, they also destroyed 2 launchers with Grom-2 experimental ballistic missiles and a Ukrainian-made Neptune anti-ship missile launcher in Odessa region. They also attacked a Kraken unit of the main directorate of Ukraine's intelligence, military intelligence, and that up to 40 foreign specialists, mainly from the United States, were eliminated in this strike. This is on the 25th of November. Now, of course, again, there is no corroboration of this claim, but that would imply that a large number of Americans, perhaps from the CIA, from the US intelligence community, since they were working alongside a Ukrainian Special Forces unit, which is part of Ukraine's military intelligence, with which the CIA is known to have close liaison. Anyway, a large number of American intelligence officers and perhaps other personnel, up to 40, were killed. Let me stress again, this is what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. It's not what I'm saying. I have no information about this other than what the Russian Defense Ministry are saying. But perhaps they know, and I noticed that there has been no denial of this claim from the United States up to this time. And then the Russian Defense Ministry says that they carried another attack on what they refer to as the Special Operations Forces Center. They don't say where that was, and that 70 of the Ukrainian military and 72 personnel, including personnel using uncrewed vehicles, these are water vehicles, were neutralized, as they put it. And they then go on to say that that included 9 French instructors and technical specialists. And then they say that on the 28th of November, they conducted further strikes against Ukrainian defense industry enterprises and power infrastructure, ensuring operation of these facilities. And that it was this strike that was conducted using 100 missiles, 466 Geran drones, 90 missiles and Geran drones during the combined strike. And anyway, it's difficult to get a clear picture of how many missiles, but it does look as if large numbers of missiles and drones have been used, hitting, as they say, 17 crucial objects of Ukraine's defense industry. And the defense ministry goes on to say that that Russia are continuing to daily monitor airfields, deployment areas, routes of movement of Western-made weaponry and inflict damage on them. So, a devastating strike. And note the key point about this. The Russians obviously went after HIMARS missile launchers, the ones that are used to launch the ATACMS, and they claim to have destroyed 5 of them, all in the course of a single day, the 25th of November. And they were probably some of the launchers that conducted the strikes on Russian territory. And they also claim to have attacked the intelligence center, or a command center of one of the special forces units, the rather notorious Kraken unit, operated by Ukrainian military intelligence. And they claim that 40 Western personnel were killed or neutralized in that strike, wounded in that strike, of whom the majority were Americans. And they claimed that they carried out another strike on another facility where underwater drones were being prepared. That would suggest in Odessa region. And that amongst the people who were killed or wounded, but more probably killed because they described as neutralized, were 9 French personnel. So the Russian Defense Ministry is hunting HIMARS launchers, but it's also now hunting NATO personnel, Western personnel. I mean, that is my take of what this Russian Defense Ministry report is saying. They're now actively hunting, tracking down, and either killing or wounding NATO personnel sent to Ukraine. Now, they might be wrong in their details. They might be mistaken about some of these people that they say they have killed or wounded. Maybe they were not there. Maybe the Russians have made a mistake in their targeting. Who knows? But the key takeaway is that they are now actively hunting them. Any Western contractor, CIA officer, person assisting in conducting missile launches against Russia is now a target in Ukraine for the Russian military. And, well, maybe these casualty claims that the Russians are making of Western personnel are untrue, but sooner or later, probably already, Westerners are going to start dying as a result of these decisions that have been taken over the last couple of weeks to start conducting missile strikes against Russia. And in the meantime, again, if you believe the Russians, and on this, by the way, I do, I'm confident that when they say that ATACMS launchers have been destroyed, they know what they're saying. I suspect that all those claims that one sometimes hear that the Russians are being misled by mock-ups are simply wrong. I think the Russians are perfectly able to distinguish the real thing from the mock-ups, and bear in mind they have drones that are able to observe what is happening on the battlefields in great detail. Anyway, it looks as if, again, as a result of the decision to forward deploy HIMARS vehicles close to the Russian border in order to conduct missile strikes inside Russia, large numbers of Ukrainian personnel, 30 personnel operating these launchers, according to the Russians, plus 5 of the launchers themselves have been attacked by the Russians and have been destroyed. Again, the trade-off is in Russian favor. They're not only shooting down the ATACMS missiles and the Storm Shadows themselves, they are destroying more of the launchers, and they're killing or wounding the personnel who operate them. The more we think about this decision to greenlight the use of missiles to conduct deep strikes on Russian territory, the more illogical it looks. It is causing Ukraine to lose more of its people. If the Russians are to be believed, apparently 2 of their personnel were killed in the latest ATACMS strikes, and a small number were wounded. Compare that with the 30 Ukrainian soldiers operating the HIMARS launchers that the Russians say were either wounded or killed. Again, perhaps the Russians are wrong, perhaps they're mistaken about all of this, but my own sense, my own feeling is that almost certainly they are right. And bear in mind, whilst the Russians have the ability to shoot down ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadows, as they have repeatedly demonstrated, the Ukrainians have no comparable ability to shoot down the Iskander systems that the Russians are launching against them, which again strengthens the likelihood, the probability that these Russian reports are true. So, a misconceived military strategy. It's already causing heavy losses to Ukraine. It is further depleting the limited stocks of ATACMS and ultimately Storm Shadow missiles. It is putting Ukrainians at risk. It is putting Western personnel in Ukraine at risk. It is not going to change the outcome of the war, about more of which later. Anyway, Putin is now talking again, as we can see, about potential strikes against Kiev, against the decision-making centers there. He was then also asked by Pavel Zarubin, one of his most favorite journalists, to discuss the capabilities of the Oreshnik system. And again, he provided a surprising amount of information about it, which I think that, again, people like Professor Postol and the engineer at Millennium 7 might want to take note of. He said that, first of all, he was asked whether it was true that the warheads that were used by the Oreshnik in its strike against the Yuzhmash factory did not contain explosives. He sort of admitted that that was the case, but then he went on to say, if we deploy multiple such systems, including simultaneously in a single strike, say 2, 3 or 4 systems, it will be comparable in force to the use of nuclear weapons, albeit that they are not nuclear. This is because they are A, high precision, B, not equipped with a nuclear explosive device, and do not cause environmental contamination. Yet the force would be comparable. Regarding the presence of explosives, I reiterate, this is why testing is conducted, to determine what requires further development. There is no great secret here. Experts will readily grasp what I'm referring to, experts like Professor Postol and the engineer at Millennium 7. When I speak of improvement, it primarily concerns the balance between range and warhead. The greater the range, the smaller the warhead. Conversely, the shorter the range, the more potent the warhead. The system is capable of lifting a greater payload in this scenario. That is the crux of it. For targets at various distances, different missile types are required, or at least distinct configurations of these missiles, specifically the warhead equipment. This is an area requiring attention. It is not a straightforward task, and it will likely require additional research and development work. As for the missile we used, the appropriate elements were employed as the impact components, and they served as damage agents as well. A kinetic impact is a formidable force akin to a meteorite. History has shown us the effects and consequences of meteorite impacts. They have been sufficient to create entire lakes. Consider the Tunguska event and its outcomes. The damage here, that's to say on Yuzhmash, is substantial. Everything at the center is reduced to ash, breaking down into elemental components, and objects located at depths of 3 or phosphorus 4, possibly even more floors below, are affected. These are fortified structures, not merely floors. The impact force is immense. More can be added to amplify the effect. The key point is that the functional sample has been created. It functions as intended. It is a high precision and high power weapon. So what he's basically saying is that the Oreshnik can fire both pure kinetic warheads and warheads with explosive charges, using presumably the Hextol explosive that my source told me about a short time ago. And deciding which of these warheads to use depends on the nature of the target, but also on the distance that the missile has to travel. If the missile has to travel a further distance, then it will use a lighter warhead. And he was then asked all sorts of other things that he was asked about whether there's any possibility, what he thinks about the risk of the West giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine. He said that if the West were ever to do such an irresponsible and reckless thing, then of course the Russians would respond with overwhelming force. They will never permit it to happen. He said that Ukraine does not by itself have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, at least not in any limited time frame, but it is certainly capable of producing a dirty bomb, and that is a real concern that the Russians have. And then he was asked about the attack on the decision-making centers, and he basically said that anything is possible. So he gave us a lot of information about the general situation, about how things will be conducted, and we see that the Russian Defense Ministry has given us more. And he also was asked to discuss the economic situation, which I will do so. I will do so myself in a moment. But let me repeat again, let me reiterate once more, that contrary to what some people in the West may think, the West actually does not have strong cards to play in this situation. There is no analogue to the Oreshnik system in the West. The Russians almost certainly are preparing another strike with the Oreshnik missile. Putin is dropping hints constantly that this strike this time will be targeting facilities in Kiev. This may be deliberate mischief or misdirection on Putin's part. But the system, which is still in development and is still being improved, has already demonstrated awesome capabilities. The Russians are now hunting Westerners in Ukraine, and they're destroying more and more HIMARS launchers. That is what they say. I believe them. And on the ground, the Russians are continuing to advance. Now, I started to get a better sense of what is going on the battlefronts over the last couple of days. It looks to me as if the battle for Velikaya Novosilka, which I've discussed in previous programs, is now drawing to an end. The Russians seem to be in control of roughly half of this small town. There's still a Ukrainian presence in the north of it, but it is being heavily shelled. And the Russians also seem to be capturing more of the villages to the north and west of Velikaya Novosilka, cutting the supply routes to the garrison there. It looks as if the Russians have captured at least two of the important villages south of Kurachovo, Yelizavetivka and Ilinka, and it looks as if the Ukrainians are either going to be obliged to withdraw from the remaining villages south of Kurachovo, or before long they will be at risk of being trapped. Now, there's apparently a significant amount of photographic and film evidence of the situation in Kurachovo itself. From what I could see, the Russians seem to control around 50 to 60% of the town. The Ukrainians are clearly being pushed back towards its western outskirts. The Russians, according to a report that I read in Redovka yesterday, have captured the village, the fortified village of Sontsivka, to the north of the Kurachovo reservoir. Its capture would appear to open the way for the Russians to advance towards Stary Terny and Dachny, west of the Kurachovo reservoir, risking putting the Ukrainian troops there in a trap. And the Russians also seem to be capturing more of the villages south of Pokrovsk. There's been a rather desperate article by Svetlana Morenets, who is Ukrainian, in The Spectator. It appeared 2 days ago. Its title is "Can Ukraine's Army Survive its Deserter Crisis?" And it talks about the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian forces thinning, that there's simply not enough soldiers to hold the front lines, that the Ukrainians are losing men and machines continuously, and that the mobilization that was launched in April with the mobilization age being reduced to 25 has failed to produce the number of recruits that was expected, and many of the mobilized recruits, the moment they arrive on the battlefields, they take the first opportunity that they can to desert. And there is a comment by a new commander in Russia's Kursk region. He says, "We're in this war until the end, but the front line is collapsing, and one of the main reasons is desertion." And this commander has suggested all kinds of draconian measures that should be implemented to stop this desertion process, which I'm not going to discuss further. And we're told also that most of the rotations, this is from this article by Svetlana Mironets, most of the rotations are just transfers from one hotspot to another, from Pokrovsk to Chasov Yar and back, that the soldiers are becoming increasingly exhausted, that the morale is low, and that the recruitment crisis, in effect, is deepening and that young men, increasingly, or recruitment age men, are increasingly unwilling to appear openly in the streets, because if they do, they risk being seized by the incredibly ruthless Ukrainian recruitment agencies. So there doesn't seem to be a solution to this. Well, there isn't a solution to this problem. The United States, to be more precise, the Biden administration and some European governments are piling on the pressure on Ukraine to reduce the recruitment age to 18. The Moon of Alabama has just republished its previous analysis from about 6 months ago, pointing out that the actual number of young men between the ages of 18 to 25, that particular demographic in Ukraine, is very small, and that enlisting it to fight in the battle will tip over, will push Ukraine into a demographic downward spiral from which quite possibly it might never be able to re-emerge. And anyway, going back to Svetlana Mironets's piece, she makes the following point about Pokrovsk, which the Russians, the trend of the battle around Pokrovsk is for the Russians to take more and more villages to the south of Pokrovsk. They're widening, this is a very common Russian practice, widening their front south of Pokrovsk in order to enable themselves to attack to break into Pokrovsk from multiple directions and potentially to outflank Pokrovsk by cutting off its supply lines from the west. Anyway, she says this about Pokrovsk. Outnumbered and outgunned, Ukrainian soldiers are fortifying the streets, but without fresh reinforcements, they won't hold out for very long. This will soon become an acute dilemma for Zelensky. He can't afford to lose more of Ukraine's land, but who will stop Putin if more soldiers decide to walk away? Well, I suspect that what people like Morenets would like to see is Western soldiers coming in to take the place of the Ukrainian ones. But as I've said, all of these plans will certainly be resisted by the Russians. If the gateway to flooding Ukraine with Western troops is getting some kind of freeze of the conflict, with the Russians agreeing, then that simply isn't going to happen. And going back to Putin's press conference, he gave another very bitter account of his attempts and of the Russian attempts to negotiate with the Western powers. He all but said that Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders basically agreed to the dissolution. They gave up. They allowed the Soviet Union to dissolve in order to be accepted by the West. They made concession after concession to the West in order to get acceptance from the West. The West simply went on making demand after demand after demand, pocketing every concession and then coming back and asking for more. Putin also revisited the whole difficult and for him, very aggravating story of the Minsk agreement, how all sorts of things appear to have been agreed to end the conflict in Ukraine through the Minsk agreement. The Germans and the French signed up to them. And, well, it didn't come to pass. And he clearly feels that the Germans and the French specifically betrayed him. They didn't ensure that the Ukrainians honored the promises that they had made in Minsk. And, in fact, they aided and abetted the Ukrainians in going back on those promises. And Putin has spoken more critically in this press conference about Angela Merkel than he has ever done in any other press conference that I have seen. A journalist who I suspect was asked to pose this question mentioned the fact that in her recent memoir, Merkel has trotted out again the story about how she had this meeting with Putin and that Putin intentionally let loose his dog on her in order to unsettle her, because she is someone who has a phobia of dogs. Putin has repeatedly said that he had no idea that Merkel had any phobia of dogs, that he apologized to Merkel about this, and that Merkel accepted his apology. He's clearly furious that Merkel has once again resurrected that old story. He says that Merkel should not go on deceiving people in such a bad cause. So I get the sense that Putin is in any mood to make any significant concessions. And when he was asked what the Russians were prepared to agree to in order to get negotiations started, he made it clear over the course of the press conference that the Russians were setting no preconditions for negotiations. They have never set preconditions in order to start negotiations. But in terms of his terms, of Russia's terms, they are the same ones that he set out in his meeting with the foreign ministry back in June. Acceptance of the four regions as Russian, acceptance of Crimea as Russian, Ukraine permanently out of NATO, and various other changes in Ukraine's internal arrangements, taking as the starting point what was agreed back in April 2022 in Istanbul. My overwhelming feeling reading these comments of Putin's is that he has no intention of going back on any of this. As far as he is concerned, the Russians and the Russians and he himself have made more than enough concessions. They are not prepared any longer to make any more. That they've made concession after concession after concession. The time has come for the concessions to be made to them, not by them. So there we are. That's Putin. I don't myself think, as I said, that this is going to change. He had many other things to say. He spoke about the fact that he couldn't understand the conduct of Western leaders as they destroy Europe's economy. Spoke specifically about the German leaders. He spoke rather subtly about some of these leaders seeming to follow to act on a mission provided to them by the intelligence agencies. You can draw whatever conclusions from that you wish. He actually had some rather good things to say about Donald Trump. He made it clear again that he was prepared to speak to Donald Trump and to have dealings with him, but without making any indication of concessions. And he also gave his own account of the telephone conversation with Olaf Scholz, the recent conversation with Olaf Scholz. And he basically said that the two leaders disagreed with each other. So, an interesting press conference with Putin. But anybody who thinks that the Russians are going to be bluffed into agreeing to freezes or deployments of European troops, or that they can be bluffed into doing those things, is ignoring the realities on the battlefield and the extent to which the Russians have exhausted their patience over, well, the 10 years of the Ukrainian crisis. And going beyond that, Putin gave some very interesting comments about why NATO assurances on NATO simply cannot be trusted. He said that back in 2008, many European leaders told him, this is at the time of the Bucharest summit, that they were opposed to Ukraine entering NATO. And then he asked them, why in that case did you agree to the provision in the Bucharest, at the Bucharest NATO meeting, to issue not quite an invitation to Ukraine to enter NATO, but to make a statement that Ukraine would one day enter NATO. And the Europeans said to him, well, it was because the Americans put pressure on us to do that. And Putin came back and said, well, in that case, what you're telling me is that even though you say you oppose this and won't agree to that now, someday when the Americans put the same pressure on you, you will agree to it. And at that point, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. If we in Russia are unwise enough to leave the decision up to you. So I don't get the sense that Putin himself is in any mood to compromise. As I said, I think he is tired, and he also said some very harsh things about the way in which United States, US domestic politics are conducted. He said that the thing that had profoundly shocked him is that at the same time as assassination attempts were being made against Donald Trump himself, he continued to be exposed to lawfare and also to legal attacks on his friends and family. And he said, his words were, our gangsters, that's to say Russian gangsters, do not engage in such behavior. When criminal groups clash amongst themselves, they do not involve women and children, they leave them be. Men fight amongst themselves, but these individuals, you can fill out who he means, in the United States, did involve them. Can you believe it? It is so repugnant that it underscores once more the complete disarray of today's American political system. So, anybody who's looking to Putin to negotiate, to agree simply to what all of these proposals that are floating around want him to agree to, are deluding themselves. Now, let's touch briefly on the state of the Russian economy. There's been wobbles in the ruble. There always are at this time of year. We are in a situation where, because of the growth of the Russian economy, because of the growth of real wages, Russians have lots of money to spend. The New Year holiday is just over the horizon. They're buying heavily, especially buying cars, by the way. Production of cars in Russia is rising, and sales of cars is rising. I think that production of cars in Russia rose by around 40% this year, and car sales have risen perhaps even more. Bear in mind that there's been a long period when Russians were not buying cars because of falls in real wages, the pandemic, the initial effect of the sanctions, and all of that. Now, all of that inevitably is going to suck in some imports, and that's going to put downward pressure on the exchange rate. There's also the additional factor, which Alex and I discussed in a recent program, which is that the Western governments have just imposed sanctions on Gazprom Bank, the one big Russian bank, still in the SWIFT system, the bank through which Western buyers of oil and gas paid the Russians. Now that's no longer going to be possible. It does look as if direct sales of oil and gas by the Russians to Europe and the United States are definitely coming to an end. That is a disaster for Europe at a time when gas supplies are very tight and the winter promises to be very cold. But obviously, again, it causes certain short-term issues which have affected the exchange rate. It is also likely that some Russian corporates are probably at this very time paying off debt, and that may mean that they're converting rubles into dollars, and that has put a downward pressure on the exchange rate as well. This is very common at this time of year. Usually the ruble weakens in the weeks leading up to the new year, and then it starts to strengthen in January when Russian corporates start buying rubles in order to have enough rubles to pay their taxes to the government. But overall, if you're looking at the general situation in Russia today, the economy looks pretty solid. The government has announced that over the first 9 months of the year, the budget was actually in surplus, that receipts from the non-oil and gas sector have been so strong because of the rapid economic growth that it has actually pushed the budget into surplus. Of course, if the economy starts to slow, which almost certainly it will, then those receipts will fall, and it is likely that the budget will go into deficit. It might go into deficit over the remaining weeks of the year. But overall, the government's fiscal position looks solid. The country continues to run a significant trade surplus. Russian banks are no longer connected to the Western financial system. They don't have debts to repay. So there is no real prospect of a run on the banks or of the banks themselves facing demands from Western creditors that they're unable to meet, as was the case in the 1998 crisis, and as also came very close to happening during the 2008-2009 crisis. The central bank has been raising interest rates to try to slow the economy down in order to bring inflation back under control. It is finding it very difficult to do in the run-up to the new year holiday, because all this extra spending from Russian consumers is reducing the impact of the recent interest rate hikes. And over the last few weeks, there is some evidence of an economic acceleration. But overall, I suspect that as the central bank wants, the economy is going to start to slow, and we will probably see a fall off of growth before the new year and into January as well. But to repeat again, this is something that the central bank is itself trying to achieve as it tries to bring inflation down from the current levels of between 8 and 9% back towards its 4% target, which it wants to achieve in 2026. So, no sign of economic exhaustion there. On the contrary, what we're seeing instead is evidence of renewed growth, of sustained growth. And of course, Putin, in the speech that I discussed yesterday, spoke about further increases in military output, in output of military goods. He said that production of missiles, long-range missiles in Russia next year is due to increase by a rate of 25 to 30%. There is no sign that there is any shortage of manpower in the Russian army. On the contrary, the Ukrainians are complaining that the number of Russian troops is increasing, even as the number of Ukrainian troops is declining. There has been a fascinating article by France 24, of which I know, again, because I have been provided by this, because it was sent to me by Jeff Roberts. And this deals with the question of North Korean troops in the fighting zone in Ukraine. I should say that the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, is currently in North Korea. Anyway, the title of this article is "What do we know about the North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia?" And it is dated 23rd November 2024. Well, this article examines every single photograph and video that has been published purporting to prove the presence of North Korean troops in Russia. I think I can summarize it by saying that the pictures that appear to show, or have been claimed to show, North Korean troops in eastern Russia, in the area, in other words, the territory, in reasonable proximity to North Korea, may be true, though it is not definite that they actually show North Korean troops. However, all of the pictures and videos that purportedly show North Korean troops in the Kursk region that have been published up to this time are either fakes or videos that actually show something completely different. One video, for example, shows a Chinese volunteer, a known Chinese volunteer, and misidentifies him as North Korean. Either they are fakes or they are cases of misidentification, or they are impossible to confirm. It's impossible to confirm that they really do show North Koreans. They may be genuine pictures, but it's not clear that they do actually show North Korean troops in Kursk. So some Western commentators have sought to claim that the presence of the North Koreans in Kursk region is another sign that the Russian army is becoming exhausted and is short of men and is having to recruit troops from North Korea. According to France 24, we don't even definitely know that the North Koreans are even there. I believe that they are not, just to say. So, no sign that the Russians are exhausted, no sign that their casualties are such as to prevent them continuing the war. There's no sign that their economy is in crisis. All of these assumptions that in any negotiations it's the West that holds the stronger cards are simply mistaken. And the sooner President Trump and General Kellogg and the other officials in the incoming administration understand that, the better it would be for them. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me just say that tomorrow I will return to the situation in the Middle East and the recent fighting in Syria. I haven't had the time to do so in this program. But in the meantime, just to repeat once again, for the moment, we are in that complex time before the new administration takes office. I think one can start to see that the attempted escalation by the Biden administration in the run-up to Trump's inauguration is already starting to look as if it has failed to achieve its objective. The Russians have successfully countered it with the Oreshnik and their destruction of the HIMARS launchers, and that they're already hunting Western troops in Ukraine. And the Russians are in an implacable mood and likely to remain so and continue to hold all the high cards. So this is where today's program ends. More from me soon. We remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.